Every day, Ethan Carter wears the mask of strength, a young billionaire and widowed father raising twin babies alone after a devastating accident took his wife. He builds empires by day and drowns in silence by night. Until one ordinary afternoon, he comes home early and everything changes. In the kitchen, he finds Naomi, the new housekeeper, bathing his children in the sink, singing a lullaby that no one had sung since their mother died. His breath catches, his heart breaks, and something he thought was gone forever stirs inside him. Was this a boundary crossed or a wound being healed? Stay with us. This is a story about second chances, quiet courage, and the unexpected ways a broken home can learn to love again. Ethan Carter hadn't planned on coming home early. Meetings at the firm had been postponed, traffic had been surprisingly merciful, and for reasons he didn't care to analyze, he hadn't told anyone he was leaving. He just drove. No phone calls, no assistant, no driver, just him behind the wheel, windows up, silence in the cabin. It was a Tuesday, dreary and grey, and the Carter estate sat quietly at the end of a winding drive, as if even the house was holding its breath. When he stepped inside, the smell of something faintly floral touched his memory. Not Emily's perfume, not exactly, but enough to stir something. He loosened his tie, slid his jacket off, and walked toward the back of the house. The sound hit him before the scene did. Laughter. Light, genuine, unmistakably belonging to his sons. He hadn't heard them like that he couldn't even remember when. They didn't laugh like that with him. They didn't laugh like that at all. Curiosity pulled him down the hallway, faster than he meant to walk. And then he turned the corner into the kitchen and froze, his body reacting before his thoughts could catch up. What he saw didn't make sense, not at first. Naomi was kneeling in front of the kitchen sink, her sleeves rolled up, a soft cotton cloth in her hand. Liam and Lucas sat side by side in a double baby tub that had clearly been placed inside the basin, their tiny bodies half submerged in warm water, their curls wet and stuck to their foreheads. They were giggling uncontrollably, that pure, belly-deep baby laughter that didn't require anything except feeling safe. And Naomi was singing. Not loudly, not theatrically, just under her breath, humming a melody he didn't recognize. Her hands moved with practiced care, steady, gentle, as if she'd done this 100 times before. Her face was soft, focused, with the kind of calm that made you trust someone without knowing why. Ethan didn't know when he'd stopped breathing. All he knew was that the scene in front of him didn't belong in his house. Not because it was wrong, but because it felt too right, too intimate, too warm. He didn't remember hiring someone to hold his sons like that, to wash them like that, to sing to them like that. And for a terrifying second, he wanted to step backward, to pretend he hadn't seen anything, because what if they looked at her like that because they were forgetting Emily? But he didn't step back. He stepped forward, too hard. His foot hit the tile louder than it should have, and Naomi's head jerked toward him, startled. Her eyes widened as they met his, and though she didn't move, he could see her whole posture shift, the way someone does when they realize they've crossed a line. Ethan didn't know what to say, so what came out was sharp, clipped, and too loud. "What are you doing?" Naomi blinked, her hands immediately rising from the water like she'd been burned. I was just... They were crying," she stammered. "They were flushed. I thought they had a slight fever. I couldn't find the thermometer." Her voice trembled slightly, but she held his gaze. "I remembered warm water helped last time. I wasn't trying to overstep. You were bathing my kids," he snapped, his voice rising without permission. "In the kitchen sink. Like they're yours." The words landed heavier than he meant, and her face went pale. "I didn't mean to make it look that way," she whispered. "I was just trying to comfort them, and somehow that made it worse, because she had succeeded." Ethan turned to the twins. Liam was sucking on a wet corner of a washcloth, completely unbothered, and Lucas was blinking up at Naomi like she hung the moon. Not even a flicker of fear or discomfort. If anything, they looked content, which infuriated him in a way he didn't understand. "You're not their nanny," he said, stepping closer, voice low and firm. "You're the housekeeper. You clean, you don't touch them." Naomi flinched, but didn't back away. "There was no one else here, sir. They needed something. I couldn't just let them cry and sweat like that." Her hands gripped the edge of the sink. "I know I'm not a mother. I know I'm not family, but I've seen this before. My brother used to spike fevers like that. Ethan raised a hand. "I don't need your life story," he said coldly. And yet, he couldn't stop looking at the twins. Naomi began wrapping them in towels, one by one, movements still careful even as her eyes burned with shame. She didn't rush, didn't drop them, didn't crumble, but she was shaking. For a long moment, Ethan didn't speak. He stood in the center of the kitchen like someone who'd been dropped there with no instructions. He knew how to talk to investors, to executives, to strangers who wanted something from him. But Naomi wasn't asking for anything. She'd already given it: comfort, presence, safety, and maybe that's what stung the most, that she had done something so essential, so intimate, and he hadn't even realized his sons had needed it. That somewhere in the blur of meetings, grieving, and running from his own house, he had left them emotionally motherless, and Naomi had stepped in, quietly, gently, effectively. But all Ethan could see right now was how little control he had. And control had been the only thing keeping him upright for months. "Towel them off and take them upstairs," he said stiffly. "Then we'll talk." Naomi nodded once, without a word, and lifted Liam first, pressing a kiss to his damp hair. Ethan noticed that, and hated how much it looked like something Emily used to do. He stayed in the kitchen long after Naomi disappeared upstairs. The floor was wet in places. One of the tiny socks was still clinging to the leg of the island. Ethan picked it up and sat on a stool, sock in hand, throat burning. He didn't cry. Not then. But something fractured in him. Something that had stayed sealed since the funeral. He looked at the sock, then toward the hallway, then back to the sink. The water had been drained. The tub was empty, and still it felt like the most alive this house had been in months. He thought of Naomi's voice, soft and uncertain, trying to explain something she should never have had to. He thought of how easily Lucas had relaxed in her arms, and he thought of how angry that made him, and how unfair that was. He didn't know if he was going to fire her or thank her. He only knew that he had seen something he couldn't unsee, something sacred, something intimate, something that made his grief feel like a coward's excuse. And it all started and ended with the sound of his sons laughing and a woman bathing them at the sink. Naomi folded the last blouse into her suitcase with the same quiet resolve she had used to iron it 2 days before. No one had told her to pack. There had been no official dismissal, no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices. But the silence in the house that morning had said everything. Ethan hadn't spoken a word to her since yesterday's incident. Not during breakfast, not while she moved quietly through the rooms she once cleaned without thinking. His eyes had barely met hers. She'd seen this kind of silence before, a passive, surgical kind of separation, where things aren't broken with noise, but with distance. So, she packed. Not bitterly, not dramatically. Just as a woman who'd learned how to exit without being asked. The suitcase was small, worn at the corners, and didn't take long to fill. Her toothbrush, the cardigan she wore on cold mornings, the picture of Elijah she always kept tucked into her journal. She didn't expect a thank you or even a goodbye. She had crossed a line, and lines like that weren't meant to be forgiven, not in houses like this, not by men like Ethan Carter. So, she zipped the bag, glanced once toward the nursery, and moved toward the door. Ethan stood in his office, holding a coffee mug he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. He didn't know she was leaving, but he wasn't surprised either. Somewhere inside, he had expected her to. wanted her to even. Not because she had done something terrible, but because what she had done had rattled something in him, something too close, too raw. She had stepped in and done what he should have done, what Emily would have done, and that filled him with shame he didn't know how to process. Watching her carry the twins with such ease, hearing them laugh for her, recognizing their trust in someone who wasn't him, it made him feel like a placeholder in his own home, like a father in name only. He didn't know how to hold that feeling, so he buried it under control. Rules, boundaries, definitions. She was the housekeeper, nothing more. That was the safe truth he needed to cling to. So if she was packing, maybe it was for the best. Maybe silence was the cleanest way to sever the line that blurred too quickly. He stood there, unmoving, waiting for the sound of the door to click shut behind her. But before the door could open, a cry cut through the stillness. Then another, high-pitched, urgent. It was the kind of cry no parent ever forgets. The kind that carried heat behind the throat, the kind that demanded immediate attention. Naomi dropped her hand from the doorknob and spun toward the stairs before thinking. Ethan froze for a second too long, then moved too quickly, the coffee mug forgotten on the desk. By the time he reached the nursery, Naomi was already there, crouched by the crib, pressing the back of her hand gently to Lucas's forehead. His cheeks were flushed, skin damp, body restless. Beside him, Liam stirred, a similar heat radiating from his tiny frame. Naomi's movements were fluid, instinctual. "It's the same fever from before," she said quickly, not waiting for permission. "But it's spiked. Their breathing's shallow." Ethan stood just inside the doorway, every cell in his body screaming to act, but paralyzed by the weight of his helplessness. Naomi looked up once. "We can't wait this time. If they seize, it gets complicated fast." Her voice was steady but urgent. She had seen this before. She knew what was coming, and Ethan didn't argue. He didn't move to stop her. He just nodded, silent. Naomi didn't waste a second. She scooped Liam into her arms, motioned for Ethan to take Lucas. Together, they brought the boys downstairs, Naomi instructing softly as she moved. "Strip them to their diapers, keep them upright. Cool compresses, but nothing ice cold. We need to lower their core temperature gradually." Ethan followed her voice like it was oxygen. In the kitchen, she dampened cloths, mixed a fast electrolyte solution, her hands moving like they remembered something no textbook ever taught. "My brother used to get fevers like this," she said, her voice clipped, not emotional. "It always started like this, high temp, shallow breathing. We couldn't always get to a hospital in time, so I learned what worked." She handed Ethan the cloth, guided his hand to Liam's underarm. "Here, hold it there." Their eyes met for a second, and something in Ethan cracked. Not because she was saving his sons, but because he knew with absolute clarity that she had done this before. Not for money, not for obligation, but out of love, the kind that had nothing to do with blood. He didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. He just did exactly what she told him. Minutes passed like hours. The boys began to cool. Their breathing slowed. The flush in their cheeks faded just slightly. But enough. Naomi exhaled, sitting back against the wall, wiping her forehead. Ethan sat across from her, legs stretched, holding Lucas against his chest. What exactly did you just do?" he asked, not accusing, just trying to understand. Naomi didn't look at him right away. "My brother had epilepsy. When he was little, he'd spike fevers that turned into seizures. We didn't always have medicine. I dropped out of nursing school to care for him full-time after our parents died." Her voice didn't break. It didn't need to. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. He had never asked. He hadn't cared to know. She was just the maid who showed up on time and cleaned well. And now, here she was, saving the two people who meant the world to him. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" he asked quietly. Naomi shrugged. No one asked the maid about her life. The answer hit him like a brick to the chest. He didn't reply, couldn't. Instead, he looked down at Lucas, who had fallen asleep on his chest, hand curled into Ethan's shirt. Across the room, Naomi cradled Liam, whose eyes blinked slowly, already heavy with sleep. The crisis had passed, for now, but nothing felt the same. Ethan didn't know what he would say tomorrow, whether he would ask her to stay or still insist she go. But in that moment, he listened, to her voice, to her past, to the truth that had been there all along, waiting to be heard. Naomi hadn't crossed a line. She had stepped into a space that had been abandoned, a space that desperately needed care. And in doing so, she had drawn a new line entirely, not between roles, but between souls, one he wasn't ready to erase. Naomi stood in the nursery doorway, clutching the folded baby blanket against her chest, like it might unravel if she let go. She had told Ethan she would stay just one more week, only until the boys were fully recovered. Her voice had been clear, her words chosen carefully, as if she didn't trust herself to say more than that. And Ethan had agreed, quietly, nodding without looking her in the eyes. The truth was, she didn't know if she could stay longer than that. Not because she didn't want to, she did, desperately, but because staying meant hope, and hope meant risk. Every night that week, when the boys had settled into their cribs, Naomi resumed something she hadn't done in years. She sang. The song wasn't famous or even particularly beautiful. It was a quiet, simple hymn her grandmother used to hum while caring for her brother Elijah on his worst nights. Naomi hadn't sung it out loud since the day he died. But now, in the dim light of a house that still whispered grief in every corner, her voice returned, soft but steady, carrying memory, and maybe something more. The boys responded to it instantly, eyelids fluttering, little hands relaxing. It was as if they recognized it, even though they'd never heard it before. Down the hall, Ethan found himself listening night after night. He didn't mean to at first. The first evening, he had simply paused by the nursery door on his way to the study, caught by the unexpected sound of music. But he couldn't move. Her voice wasn't loud. If anything, it sounded like something not meant to be heard by anyone else, but that only made it harder to walk away. Each word was a thread, and together they wove something raw and aching into the air. Ethan leaned against the wall, hands stuffed into his pockets, eyes closed as the melody soaked into him. It didn't sound like Emily. Emily had sung like she was daring the world to love her. Big, joyful, radiant. Naomi sang like she was carrying something that weighed more than her own body, and yet still refused to let it drop. Ethan couldn't help but feel the difference, couldn't help but grieve the contrast, and still he returned the next night, and the next, always at a distance, always silently. There was something sacred about not being seen, about letting the music reach him without her knowing. On the third night, he brought a chair from his office and placed it just beyond the nursery threshold. He didn't sit. He stood behind it, unsure what he was even doing there, pretending like he had business to tend to on his phone. But the moment she began singing, the illusion faded. There was no pretending when her voice filled that space. He watched the silhouettes of his sons, now more settled, less restless, sleeping deeper than they had since Emily died. Something in Naomi's song, in the rhythm, the way it rose and fell like the gentlest tide, seemed to quiet everything. Not just the babies, but the house, maybe even himself. For the first time in months, he didn't feel like a man chasing the shadow of his dead wife, or a father trying to keep his children breathing while drowning in silence. He felt still, present. Naomi never turned to look at him. If she knew he was there, she gave no sign. That made it easier somehow, like they both knew the rules of this fragile arrangement. He wouldn't thank her, and she wouldn't ask him to. By the fifth night, he found himself humming the tune unconsciously as he walked down the hall with a warm bottle. He caught himself halfway through and stopped, startled. The melody was stuck in his chest, and he hated how right it felt. How it had replaced the song Emily used to sing, the one with all the laughter and lightness, the one that now felt foreign and unreachable. Naomi's song didn't try to lift the pain. It sat with it, it acknowledged it, it made space for it without judgment. And maybe that's why it worked. Not just on the boys, but on him. That night he hovered longer in the doorway than he meant to, arms folded tight across his chest. She had finished singing and was whispering softly to the boys now, tucking the blankets under their chins, pressing her lips gently to their foreheads, like it was a ritual she had performed forever. Ethan wanted to say something, anything. Ask where the song came from. Ask why it made him feel like he was being undone slowly, thread by thread, but his throat closed around the words before they could leave. So he did what he always did. He stayed silent. Naomi never acknowledged his presence, not once, but she had noticed the chair. She noticed how the creak of the floorboards had a rhythm now, how he always showed up around the same time. And even though he didn't speak, his silence had shifted. It wasn't sharp like it used to be. It didn't cut. It waited. She didn't sing louder for him. She didn't perform, but she let the song breathe more freely. She allowed herself to close her eyes when she sang, to let her voice tremble a little when a memory hit her too hard. She allowed herself to feel Elijah again, his tiny hands, the way he used to curl into her when the world felt too heavy. She had thought that part of her was gone forever, but somehow these boys had awakened it again. And through them, strangely, so had Ethan. She didn't understand him, not entirely, but there was something in the way he lingered, in the way he kept coming back without saying a word, that told her everything she needed to know. And so the week passed. The boys healed, their fevers faded, their giggles returned, and every night as they drifted off to sleep, Naomi sang the same quiet melody that had once carried her brother through his worst nights. It was a song made of grief and love stitched together, soft at the edges, but impossible to forget. Ethan never asked her to stop. He never asked her to continue either. He simply kept showing up, in the hallway, behind the door, sometimes a little closer, listening, remembering, mourning, hoping. And though the house still echoed with Emily's absence, Naomi's song was the only thing that moved through it like it belonged. It was the only thing that reminded him that even in brokenness, something gentle could still remain, something real, something that didn't ask to be noticed, only heard. Ethan hadn't been looking for anything. He was just trying to find the crib sheet Lucas had soiled earlier that morning. The linen closet near the laundry room was usually kept neat, but after a chaotic week of fever, bottles, and interrupted sleep, things were starting to slip. He reached for the bottom shelf, where clean baby blankets were stacked, or should have been, and as he pulled at the corner of one, something fluttered out and landed face down near his foot. It was small, bent at the edges, and coated with the faint smudge of laundry powder. He picked it up absently, expecting a misplaced note or receipt, but when he turned it over, the image hit him like a silent punch. Naomi. Her smile was broad and open, eyes squinting in the kind of happiness that didn't ask for permission. Beside her, a boy, maybe 12 or 13, sat in a wheelchair, his grin crooked but radiant, hand half raised in a wave. They looked alike. Not quite siblings, but bonded. Ethan stared at it longer than he meant to. The boy's fingers curled awkwardly over the edge of the chair's armrest, his legs too thin for his frame. The photo wasn't new, but it had been protected, handled, loved. He didn't move for a long time. Something about the picture unsettled him, not in a way that disturbed, but in the way it nudged a part of him that had been rusted shut. Naomi had never mentioned a sibling. Not once. Not in passing, not even during their brief, tense conversation when she'd spoken about recognizing the boy's fever. And yet, here it was, a window into something private, sacred even. Ethan knew better than to bring it up. There was no way to ask about the boy in the photo without intruding on a part of Naomi that she clearly hadn't offered freely. But even as he slipped the photo back between the folds of the laundry, careful to leave it exactly where he found it, something inside him shifted. He realized he had made the mistake of seeing Naomi only through function, what she did for the house, for the boys, for him. But the girl in that picture, and the look in her eyes, told a different story. She knew loss. She knew joy that didn't last. She knew how to love someone who might leave too soon, and for the first time, Ethan saw her not as his employee, but as someone who had also been broken in ways that didn't heal clean. Later that evening, Ethan found himself pacing the kitchen, wondering if he should say something. He knew better than to push. Naomi had worked all afternoon without pause, folding laundry, organizing drawers, making small noises with the boys that made them laugh with their whole bodies. She didn't seem to notice the slight awkwardness in Ethan's posture, the way he hesitated before entering a room. He watched her with new eyes, observing not just what she did, but how she did it. The way she tucked in the edges of Liam's blanket tighter than necessary, the way her hand lingered on Lucas's head for just an extra second as he drifted off to sleep. There was a gentleness there, not performative, not mechanical, but rooted in experience, in ache. Ethan couldn't name what he was feeling. It wasn't guilt exactly, or gratitude. It was something murkier, something deeper, respect, perhaps, or the quiet realization that he'd misjudged someone who had never asked for anything but the space to do what she was good at. That alone made him want to say something, not an apology, but an acknowledgement. It was after dinner, when the boys had finally settled, that Ethan found Naomi rinsing out bottles at the sink. She hadn't noticed him approach at first, and for a moment, he watched her in silence. The way she moved was unhurried, methodical. The same rhythm as her singing, steady, soft, deeply present. He cleared his throat gently, and she turned, startled only slightly. "Would you like some tea?" he asked. Naomi blinked. "Sure," she said, drying her hands on a towel. He moved to the cupboard, took down 2 mugs, something he hadn't done for anyone since Emily. As he filled the kettle and set it to boil, he glanced at her. She had already begun tidying up again. "Naomi," he said, and the way her name landed in the air made her stop. He rarely said it. Usually it was Miss Brooks, or nothing at all, but now it came out softer, like it meant something. She turned to face him fully, brows slightly furrowed. "Yes?" she asked, voice low. Ethan hesitated for only a second. "You've done a lot for this house," he said. "For them. For me." She looked surprised, not defensive, just quietly caught off guard. She didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. The tea steeped in silence. Ethan handed her a mug, and they stood there for a moment, not talking, not explaining, just sharing the quiet. Naomi took a sip, and her eyes briefly flicked toward him with a softness that hadn't been there before. Maybe she sensed the shift, maybe she didn't. But something in the room had changed. A line had moved, no roles were discussed, no boundaries were redrawn. But in the way he said her name, and in the fact that he'd said it at all, Naomi understood. She didn't know he had seen the photo, that he had stared at it longer than he should have, that he had memorized the boy's smile. But she felt the difference, and Ethan, for the first time, wasn't thinking of her as the help or as a caretaker hired in haste. He was thinking of her as someone who carried stories too heavy to be spoken in passing. Someone who had chosen to stay even when walking away would have been easier. And as they stood there, sipping quiet tea in a kitchen that had known too much silence, recognition settled between them. Not loud, not sudden, but real. And so that night, Ethan offered her nothing more than tea and her name. But for Naomi, it was enough, more than enough. Because for the first time since she arrived, she wasn't being asked to prove herself. She wasn't being reduced to a task or a role. She was being seen. Ethan didn't bring up the photograph. He didn't ask about the boy. But his silence was different now, no longer detached, no longer indifferent. It held something human, something open. And as she sipped her tea slowly, letting the warmth fill her chest, Naomi felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Not safety, exactly, but something close, something softer, something like trust. The power went out with a sudden flicker, and then everything fell into stillness. Naomi stood in the kitchen with a half-warmed bottle in her hand when the refrigerator went silent and the overhead lights dimmed, then died. She paused, waiting to see if it would return, but it didn't. From upstairs came the unmistakable cries of the twins, sharp, startled, rising fast. She didn't call for Ethan. She didn't expect him to come. Instead, she moved quickly, grabbing the emergency candles she had noticed in the pantry days before, lighting them with steady hands. She moved through the darkened halls with quiet efficiency, not rushing, but not wasting a second. She had done this before. She had walked through blackouts with Elijah screaming in the next room, afraid of the dark, afraid of the seizures. Her body remembered what to do, even when her mind went quiet. Upstairs, the cries turned desperate, confused. Naomi pushed open the nursery door, placed a candle on the dresser, and reached down into the cribs with the kind of calm that only people who've had to carry chaos know how to hold. The boys quieted the moment she lifted them, one against each shoulder, their cries muffled against her collarbone. Ethan sat in the living room, unmoving, a flashlight on the coffee table beside him that he hadn't bothered to turn on. He had heard the power die, had heard the twins cry, had even flinched at the sound of it. But his feet didn't move. It wasn't that he didn't care. He cared too much. That was the problem. The moment they cried like that, panic clawed up his throat because every time he tried to comfort them and failed, it was another reminder that Emily was gone and he wasn't enough. His hands didn't know where to go. His voice didn't soothe. He had tried in the first few months so many times, rocking them, pacing the hallways, whispering anything he could think of. But the boys never calmed with him the way they did with her, or now, with Naomi. And somewhere along the way, a part of him had stopped trying. Not out of apathy, but out of fear. Fear that he would never be enough, that they would feel it, that he would ruin something fragile. So he sat there now in the dark, heart racing, listening to Naomi carry his sons through the hallway with that same song, that same unshakable rhythm. And he felt both grateful and ashamed. She entered the room like she belonged there, cradling one boy in each arm, candlelight flickering behind her. Naomi didn't ask for permission. She just sat on the edge of the couch, placed Liam gently in Ethan's arms, and held Lucas to her chest. Ethan instinctively reached out, awkward at first, unsure of himself, but the moment Liam's tiny body curled against him, something cracked inside. "You're okay," Ethan whispered, barely audible, more to himself than to the baby. Naomi didn't speak. She rocked Lucas slowly, her eyes lowered, her hand rubbing slow circles against his back. Minutes passed in heavy silence, the kind that didn't demand words, only presence. Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and felt the rising weight of everything he hadn't said, everything he had buried under work and grief and distance. The storm rumbled outside, unnoticed. What mattered was in front of him. "I've been afraid," he said finally, voice tight. "Not just of losing them, but of being what they need." He laughed bitterly. "I thought if I kept moving, working, organizing, I'd somehow protect them. But they cry and I freeze, and then you come in and they're fine." His voice cracked. "It kills me." Naomi didn't respond with reassurance or platitudes. She didn't try to fix his words. She just sat beside him, holding one child, watching the other fall asleep against his father's chest. She waited, like she had done 100 times for Elijah, waited for the fear to speak its full name. When Ethan didn't say anything more, when the silence threatened to fall into something raw and irreversible, she reached out slowly and placed her hand over his. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't staged, it was grounding. Her hand was warm, steady, the kind of touch that said, "You're not alone, even if you feel like it." Ethan looked down at their joined hands, then up at her. For the first time since Emily's death, someone had met him at his lowest without backing away. Naomi didn't offer sympathy, she offered presence, and in that he felt something shift, not solved, not healed, but softened. He didn't squeeze her hand, but he didn't let go either. They sat like that for a long time, the candle burning low between them, the boys finally drifting into deep post-cry sleep. Naomi leaned back against the arm of the couch, still holding Lucas close, and Ethan leaned his head slightly toward hers, not touching, but close enough that the space between them no longer felt like a wall. He hadn't planned on saying anything that night. He hadn't planned on being seen. But sometimes storms did more than bring darkness. Sometimes they wiped everything else away so you could finally see what mattered. Naomi didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her hand in his said everything. You are enough. You are here. And they are loved. That was the real confession of the night. Not what he had said, but what she had answered in silence. And when the lights flickered back to life, neither of them moved. They didn't need light to see what had changed. They already knew. The boys slept. The house held its breath. And Ethan, still holding his son in one arm and Naomi's hand in the other, understood something for the first time in months. Maybe the only way to heal was to let someone else help carry the weight, especially when no one else was watching. It was late morning when it happened, one of those ordinary in-between moments that usually passed unnoticed. Naomi was sitting on the living room rug, legs crossed, a wooden spoon in one hand and a plastic mixing bowl in the other, playing an impromptu game of rhythm with the twins. Liam had already joined the concert, banging his own spoon against the floor with uncoordinated excitement. But Lucas, as always, stayed on the edges. The quieter twin, more observant, often slower to respond, he watched the game unfold with wide, serious eyes. Naomi glanced at him mid-tap and paused her drumming, cocking her head. "You gonna join us or just supervise, Mr. Lucas?" she teased gently, tapping his nose with the wooden spoon. His lip twitched. Naomi gasped, overly dramatic, and tapped the side of the bowl with flair. "Oh no, did I hear a giggle in there?" she asked, crawling toward him like a cartoon villain. Lucas blinked once, then let out a tiny puff of air that almost resembled a cough. Naomi narrowed her eyes, smiled slowly and whispered, "I'm gonna get you," before tickling his side with 2 fingers. And then it happened. The laugh, real, high-pitched, raw, Lucas's very first. Ethan was standing in the doorway, holding a stack of files he hadn't yet read, preparing to head into his office for the afternoon. But when he heard it, that sound, he stopped cold. At first, he didn't register what it was. He had heard the boys cry, fuss, even coo in contentment, but laughter. But not like that, not from Lucas, not ever. He looked up and saw it, Naomi's face lit with something just shy of wonder, her hands still hovering mid-tickle, frozen in the moment like she knew how precious it was. Lucas, cheeks pink and mouth wide, was laughing like it came from someplace deep, unlearned. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't jealousy that struck him. It wasn't even sadness. It was something closer to release, like watching a crack form in a wall you didn't realize you had been bracing against. For so long, he had feared that Lucas would never laugh. That the trauma of losing his mother so young, of growing up in a house half frozen in grief, would take from him something as basic as joy. And here it was, pouring out of him, not for Ethan, but for Naomi. And Ethan didn't resent it. He was grateful. He walked into the room quietly, setting the files down on the arm of the couch. Naomi glanced up, her expression softening. "First time?" she asked, her voice warm but measured, as if she didn't want to claim the moment entirely. Ethan nodded, crouching beside her. Lucas, still giggling, reached out one pudgy hand toward the spoon in Naomi's lap. "I've been trying to make that happen for months," Ethan admitted, his voice rougher than he expected. "Toys, songs, peekaboo, nothing." Naomi didn't reply with anything grand. She just offered a small smile and said, "Sometimes they laugh when they feel safe, not entertained." Ethan let those words settle into him. Safe. That was what this house had lacked. What he hadn't been able to rebuild since Emily died. He looked at Lucas again, and then at Naomi, who had begun drumming softly once more, inviting Liam back into the game. "Thank you," he said. It was quiet, almost apologetic. Naomi didn't respond with words. She just nodded, a gentle acknowledgement as if to say, "You're welcome, but you don't have to thank me for loving them." As the game continued and the twins giggled and kicked, Ethan sat back on his heels, letting the warmth of the moment wash over him. For the first time in what felt like years, he allowed himself to feel peace, not the kind that comes from silence or escape, but the kind born from seeing his children happy, truly happy, and knowing he hadn't needed to force it. It had come naturally, through Naomi. And for that reason, something inside him locked into place, a decision, a knowing. She couldn't leave. She wasn't just a guest in this home anymore. She wasn't temporary. She wasn't a stand-in or a stopgap. She was a thread that had woven herself into the very fabric of their lives. But the words felt too heavy in his throat and too soon. If he said it now, it might sound desperate, dependent, like he needed her because he couldn't manage without her. And maybe that was partly true, but it wasn't the whole truth. He needed her because with her, the house wasn't just surviving, it was alive again. He tried to picture the house without her, the silent halls, the twins searching for the woman whose voice had become their lullaby, whose scent they associated with comfort, whose laugh they now mimicked. The thought alone left him hollow. But how do you ask someone to stay when you're not sure what they mean to you yet, only that they mean something you can't afford to lose? How do you offer permanence to someone who never expected it? Ethan watched Naomi with a tenderness he hadn't felt toward anyone since the days before the accident. He didn't know what this was. Not love. Not yet. But it was something sacred. Something earned. And he couldn't let her walk away without honoring it. Still, he didn't speak. He just sat with the weight of the knowing and the silence that kept it safe for now. And so the day ended with something that felt like a beginning. Lucas's first laugh echoed in the corners of Ethan's chest long after the toys were cleaned up and the boys were napping. Naomi moved through the house with her usual calm, unaware of the decision quietly forming in Ethan's mind. She didn't need to know. Not yet. What mattered was that she had given something irreplaceable to his son, and in doing so, had given something equally powerful to him. Hope. She belonged here. Not because he couldn't do it alone, but because with her, none of them had to. And though he hadn't yet found the right words to say it, Ethan already knew she couldn't leave. Not now, not ever. Naomi read the email twice before even blinking. It was short, almost plain, but every word seemed to pulse with weight. The director of the West Briar Community School was offering her a part-time position as an assistant in the Early Childhood Development Program. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't come with much money, but it was everything she had wanted years ago, before Elijah's seizures became constant, before hospital bills replaced tuition, before she packed away her textbooks and her quiet dreams in the back of a storage bin. It was validation. A door, after so many had stayed shut. She placed the phone down slowly on the counter, heart pounding, and let the reality sink in. They wanted her. For her experience, for her instinct. She should have felt nothing but joy. Instead, a strange ache bloomed in her chest. She turned her head instinctively toward the nursery, toward the house that now felt more like a home than any other place she'd lived since Elijah died. The idea of leaving it behind, leaving them behind, hollowed something in her. But it was her dream, wasn't it? This was what she had wanted. So why did it suddenly feel like a loss? She didn't bring it up right away. The words stuck to the roof of her mouth every time Ethan entered the room. She could feel the conversation press against her lips, waiting for its moment, but she couldn't find a way to say it without imagining what would come next. The end of something tender, something unspoken that had grown between them. Ethan, on his end, felt something was different, but he didn't ask. He noticed how her eyes seemed preoccupied, how she lingered less with the twins, how she folded laundry without humming anymore. But he didn't press. Pride and fear fought in his chest like twin storms. What if she had finally realized this wasn't where she belonged? What if she had never planned to stay? He told himself that if she left, he could handle it, that he'd figure something out, hire someone else, rearrange his schedule. But even he knew those were lies. He had already pictured Naomi here long-term. He had started building something around her without permission, and now the floor felt like it was shifting. Still, neither of them spoke. The silence grew heavier by the day. And then, just as the silence between them deepened, the boys got sick again. It started with Liam, a cough that wouldn't settle, followed by a slight fever. Naomi noticed it first, her instincts honed by years of sleepless nights and medical charts. Within hours, Lucas followed, his breathing raspy, his little body clinging to hers like a second skin. Ethan panicked, not outwardly, not in front of her, but inside, he was unraveling. The helplessness returned, sharp and cruel. Every thermometer beep sent his stomach into knots. Every wheeze from the baby monitor tightened his chest, but Naomi moved with quiet precision. She monitored their temperatures, administered fluids, called the pediatrician when needed, and rocked them one by one through the night. Ethan watched it all unfold with a reverence he couldn't name. She didn't ask for help. She didn't wait to be told. She simply acted, not like an employee, but like someone who belonged to them. Every time he opened his mouth to ask her not to leave, to tell her that she couldn't, the words stuck. They didn't form. And somehow, that made it worse. Because now, it wasn't just fear. It was cowardice. He was choosing silence over truth. By the second night, Naomi hadn't slept more than 2 hours. She didn't complain. She never did. But Ethan could see it in her body, in the way her shoulders slumped when she thought no one was looking. He stood outside the boys' room that evening, watching her hum softly to Lucas while rubbing his back, her voice no longer strong, but still present. He wanted to walk in, to take the baby from her arms and let her rest, to say everything he had buried for weeks, but the fear paralyzed him. What if she said yes to the job? What if he told her he needed her and she chose something else? What if she thought he was only clinging because he was desperate, not because she mattered? So he turned around and walked away, retreating to the hallway. And there, in the dark, he let go. The tears came, not sudden but slow, quiet, hot. He pressed his back to the wall, slid down, and buried his face in his hands. He hadn't cried since the funeral, not like this, not freely, not without shame, but now it poured out, not just grief, but the ache of almost losing something again, of knowing he was too afraid to fight for it. Naomi heard it before she saw him, the soft, uneven breathing, the brokenness in it. She stepped into the hallway and stopped when she saw Ethan, slumped on the floor, his hands trembling slightly against his knees. He didn't see her at first. And when he did, he turned his face away quickly, ashamed. But she didn't say anything. She didn't approach with sympathy or questions. She just stood there, watching him, understanding more in that silence than any words could have offered. Naomi wanted to speak, to tell him she hadn't said yes to the school yet. That part of her was waiting for a reason to stay. But she didn't, because if he wanted her here, really wanted her, he needed to say it first. And she couldn't be the only one brave enough to name what was growing between them, so she stood quietly, giving him space to fall apart, letting him know, simply by being there, that he didn't have to do it alone. Ethan didn't ask for help, but in the way he let her see him break, he had already asked everything that mattered. And so the night passed, heavy and unspoken. Naomi held the house together once again, but her heart carried a new weight, not of decision, but of waiting. The offer from the school still sat in her inbox, unread for the third time. Ethan never brought it up. The words never came. But now she had seen something she couldn't unsee. The man behind the silence, not the stoic father or the grieving husband, but the man who had built a quiet dependency on her presence. And though he hadn't said the words out loud, his tears had whispered what his mouth couldn't. Still, that wasn't enough. Not yet. And until he found the courage to speak, Naomi stayed, not because he asked, but because she knew in her bones that love sometimes begins in the silence between two people too scared to name what's already true. Ethan hadn't opened the door to Emily's room in nearly a year. It wasn't locked, but something in him had treated it like it was. He passed by it almost every day, eyes flickering toward the doorknob and away again. The nursery, the office, the kitchen, all these spaces had slowly adjusted to a life without her. But that room remained untouched, sacred, untouchable, until tonight. He hadn't planned it. He had walked upstairs to get painkillers from the hall cabinet, but found himself standing in front of her door, hand resting on the knob. And for once, he didn't talk himself out of it. He turned it. The smell hit him first, not her perfume, not exactly, just a faint trace of fabric softener, paper, and something floral she used to keep in her drawers. The bed was made, the room was still frozen in the past. He didn't move around much. He just sat on the edge of the mattress and let the memories come one after the other like waves. And when his gaze finally dropped to the foot of the bed, he saw the box. Plain cardboard, slightly frayed at the edges, her handwriting on the top flap. For Ethan, if ever. He opened it without knowing why. Maybe part of him had been waiting for a reason. Inside were letters, dozens of them, some sealed, some not. Some were dated from early in their relationship, scribbled notes, late-night thoughts, scattered memories. He touched the edges of the paper as if it might burn. Most of them were full of her signature humor, her way of wrapping heavy truths in lightness. But one letter, dated a few months before the accident, was different. She had titled it, "In Case I'm Not There." His throat tightened. The handwriting was smaller, more deliberate. As he read, the words pressed into his chest like a weight. She talked about the boys, about the things she hoped for them, how she knew he'd be a good father, even if he doubted it. How he'd never be alone, because love had a way of finding them again, even in places they didn't expect. Let them find love in the unexpected, Ethan. Don't close the door to what doesn't look like what we had. Let them laugh, even if I'm not there to hear it. Ash. He read that sentence twice, then again, and the dam finally broke. He folded the letter against his chest and wept, not just for her absence, but for the truth she had somehow known he'd need. He didn't bother with tissues. He didn't try to hold himself together. There was something about reading her words, written without knowing how soon they'd matter, that made everything he'd buried rise to the surface. The guilt, the failure, the fear, but also something else. Something like clarity. Emily had known. She had understood, even in life, that her absence would leave holes nothing could completely fill. But she'd also believed that love wasn't meant to be repeated. It was meant to evolve. Her letter wasn't permission, it was grace. And it wasn't about Naomi specifically. She never could have known about Naomi, but it was about letting the boys be whole again, about letting himself feel without shame. He cried until he was empty, until there was nothing left in him but exhaustion. He laid down on the floor with the letter pressed to his chest, arms folded over it like armor, and somewhere between grief and acceptance, he drifted into sleep. When Naomi found him the next morning, she didn't call out. She had come upstairs quietly, carrying a warm bottle for the boys, and wondering why Ethan hadn't already started the coffee like he usually did. The nursery was empty, his office too. She followed the only path left, the one she never took. Emily's door was slightly ajar. Naomi stepped in and froze. There he was, curled on the floor, his back to the bed, his knees pulled slightly toward his chest, one arm wrapped protectively around a letter. Her first instinct was to step back out. This wasn't a space she belonged in, but something in his stillness made her stay. She walked slowly toward him, trying not to disturb whatever was holding him in that moment. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. Instead, she unfolded the throw blanket from the chair in the corner, knelt beside him, and draped it gently over his body. As she turned to go, Ethan stirred. He didn't open his eyes right away, but his hand reached out, catching her wrist, not tight but deliberate, his fingers wrapped around her skin, warm and trembling. She stopped, waited. When he finally spoke, his voice was cracked, hollowed out by a night that had taken more from him than he thought he still had left to give. "Stay," he whispered. That was all, just one word. But it wasn't the same as every other moment he'd left things unspoken. This time the word meant everything. It wasn't a request for help, it wasn't a command. It was something closer to surrender, to acknowledgement. He didn't say why. He didn't need to. Naomi knelt beside him, placing her hand gently over his again. She didn't promise anything. She didn't offer comfort she wasn't sure how to put into words, but she didn't leave, and that was enough. And so, the morning began with the same silence that had filled the house for months. But this time it didn't feel empty. Ethan remained on the floor, Naomi beside him, neither of them rushing to fix the moment. Nothing had been fully healed, but something had shifted. Emily's words lingered between them, unseen but deeply felt, giving space for whatever might come next. And for the first time, Ethan didn't just grieve what was lost, he began to consider what still could be found. Ethan had rehearsed the conversation at least a dozen times in his head. He had written down key points on a notepad the night before, then crossed them out by morning. This wasn't something that could be delivered like a business proposal. It wasn't about structuring the perfect offer or anticipating objections. It was personal, emotional, and messy. Everything he usually avoided. But after waking up on Emily's floor, letter still clutched in his hand, and Naomi sitting silently beside him, something in him had shifted for good. He couldn't pretend anymore. He couldn't continue living in that suspended space between gratitude and dependence. She had become more than necessary. She had become family, even if neither of them had dared to name it. So now, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, waiting for Naomi to finish tending to the boys, he knew there was no going back. He called her name, not hesitantly, not formally, just Naomi. And when she turned to face him, hands drying on a dish towel, he gestured toward the table. "Can we sit? I need to talk to you about something important." She sensed it immediately, the weight behind his voice. Naomi set the towel down and joined him without a word. He didn't start with flattery or anecdotes. "I want you to stay," he said simply, looking directly at her. "Not just for another week. Not just until the next fever or first steps. I want you here, long-term, permanently." Naomi blinked but didn't interrupt. Ethan continued, his voice steadier than he expected. "You've done more for these boys than anyone else could have, and not because it's your job. You've loved them, cared for them like they were your own. And I see that now, fully. I should have said this sooner." He paused, swallowing down the nerves. "I don't just want to keep you on staff. I want to make this official, as far as it can be. I'd like you to be their full-time caregiver. their figure of stability. Their mother figure, if you're willing. Naomi's lips parted, but he wasn't done. And I know that's a lot. So, I also want to offer to sponsor your return to school. Nursing, education, whatever you choose. And if it means anything, I'd like to offer you the Carter name. You don't have to accept it, of course, but it's yours if you want it. The room was still. Naomi stared at him, not blinking, her throat working around a response that took its time forming. She wasn't expecting this. Not today. Not like this. She had always told herself she was temporary. Even after everything, she had kept a quiet suitcase packed in the back of her closet, just in case. And now, here he was, offering permanence, not as a favor, not as a rescue, but as a recognition. Her chest tightened. "You want me to be part of the family?" she asked softly, not accusing, but needing clarity. Not a title, not just on paper. Ethan nodded. "Exactly that. You already are, Naomi. The boys reach for you first. They sleep better when you're nearby. They've already chosen you. I just want to make sure you know I have too." She exhaled sharply, emotions rising fast, but she kept her composure. "And the name?" she asked gently. Ethan shrugged with a soft smile. "Only if it feels right. I don't want it to be a transaction. It's not about ownership. It's about honor. I see you. I trust you. I want to share what I can, but it's your choice." Naomi felt the tears behind her eyes before she could stop them. She'd spent so many years being invisible, the quiet girl behind a mop, the caregiver no one asked about, the soul pouring herself into people who only saw her function. This offer wasn't just about a job or even a second chance. It was about being seen, truly seen, and invited to stay. She looked at Ethan, really looked at him. The man who had once barely made eye contact was now sitting across from her, offering stability, education, identity, not as a favor, but as a gift. Her heart wanted to say yes to all of it. But one part, the name, she paused on. Gently, firmly, she reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "I don't need to be a Carter to belong to them," she said, voice thick with emotion. "I already am." Ethan sat there in silence, but not the heavy kind they used to share. This silence was warm, alive. Her words had hit him in a place deeper than he expected. He felt the knot in his chest begin to loosen, the one that had convinced him for so long that family had to look a certain way, come from a certain structure. Naomi had just dismantled that with a single sentence. And she was right. She was theirs. She had been long before he admitted it. And now, hearing her say it out loud, he could finally let go of the fear of asking, of losing, of needing. He didn't push. He didn't offer more. He simply let the truth settle between them. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Ethan smiled. Not the tight, tired smile he gave clients or the hollow one he wore at the boys' first milestones, but a real smile, quiet, genuine, unburdened. Naomi smiled too, her eyes shining but proud. There were still decisions to make, papers to file, futures to shape. But in that moment, sitting across the table from each other with nothing left to hide, they both knew. Something had already shifted. Something had already been chosen. And it didn't need a last name to be real. The auditorium was filled with polite applause, camera flashes, and the quiet murmur of proud families. But Ethan could only focus on one person. Naomi stood center stage in her cap and gown, diploma in one hand, the other trembling slightly as she wiped a tear from her cheek. Her name had just been called. Naomi Brooks, Bachelor of Early Childhood Education, and the entire back row erupted with voices far louder than anyone else's. Ethan, flanked by two energetic 5-year-old boys holding handmade posters that said, "Go, Mom," and "We love you, Naomi," stood with tears stinging the back of his eyes. Liam had drawn a heart with stick figures holding hands. Lucas's poster was mostly glitter. Ethan didn't care. He clapped so hard his hands burned. Naomi scanned the crowd and found them easily. Her boys, not by birth but by bond. Ethan, their anchor. Her anchor. The journey to this moment had been long, full of hesitations and healing. But as she stepped forward to receive her diploma, the applause faded into background noise. She saw only them. The family they had built, not in a hospital, not in a courthouse, but day by day, night by night, in quiet gestures and unspoken promises. When the ceremony ended and the photographs had been taken, some blurry, some perfect, they drove home in comfortable silence. The boys sang in the back seat, arguing over who got to sit next to Naomi at dinner. Ethan drove with one hand, the other resting gently on Naomi's knee, a casual touch years in the making. No words were needed. Tonight wasn't about the future or logistics. It was about arriving. When they pulled into the driveway, Liam was already half asleep, but Lucas was wide awake, still buzzing with excitement. "I want cake," he declared. Naomi laughed and promised there was one in the fridge. After dinner, and after they wrestled the boys into pajamas, all four of them ended up in the living room, too full to move, too content to care. Lucas, nestled between Naomi's arm and Ethan's side, looked up and asked the question that paused time. "Can you sing that old song, Mommy?" His voice was hopeful, innocent, but filled with memory. Naomi glanced at Ethan. His eyes said yes. So she nodded, pulled the boys closer, and began. Her voice had changed over the years, deeper, fuller, but the song was the same, the lullaby she used to hum in desperation, then in comfort, then in love. The same tune that had cradled Elijah, then the twins, then Ethan's sleepless nights without her knowing. She sang softly, clearly, each note a thread woven into the air. The boys grew still. Even Liam, who had been mid-yawn and wiggling, quieted with wide eyes. Ethan sat on the floor near them, leaning against the couch. As she reached the second verse, he joined her, quietly, his voice low, unsure but sincere. Naomi didn't stop or falter. She let him in, like she always had. By the time the last note faded, silence followed. Not the silence of absence, but of reverence, of fullness. Then came the voice that broke it all. Lucas again, small and sure. "Mommy, can you sing it again?" Naomi smiled. She didn't rush an answer. She looked at both boys, then at Ethan, who was watching her with a softness that still surprised her. She took their little hands, one in each of hers, squeezed gently and said, "Always." That word hung in the air like a vow. Not to repeat the song once more, but to never stop being the voice they needed, to keep showing up, with her voice, her heart, her whole self. Ethan let out a slow breath and leaned his head back against the couch, closing his eyes for a moment. She was still singing, even when she wasn't. Every choice she made, every moment she stayed, was another note in the melody their lives had become. And this was their chorus. From the other side of the room, Ethan opened his eyes and looked at them, Naomi, Liam and Lucas, a perfect knot of warmth on the rug. He didn't need to raise his voice. His words came soft, but they reached her fully. "We're a family," he said. "Doesn't take blood, just courage." Naomi met his eyes. No tears this time, just that deep, quiet understanding that had always lived between them. The boys didn't quite understand what he meant, but they didn't have to. They had already lived the truth of it. Every bath, every song, every sleepless night, every second chance, they had all built this family from the ground up. And that night, in a house that had once been filled with grief and silence, there was too much life to fit in the walls. Laughter spilled out of the bedrooms. Little footsteps echoed long past bedtime, and the old melody returned again, not as a lullaby, but as a celebration. Naomi sang it once more, and this time Ethan didn't just join in. He knew the words by heart. We put our hearts into every story we share here because we know how deeply a simple story can move, comfort, and connect us. If this one spoke to you in any way, we'd be grateful to hear your thoughts in the comments. What part stayed with you? If you appreciated this video, consider subscribing to our channel. It might seem like a small gesture, but for us, it makes all the difference. Your support helps us keep creating meaningful content, crafted with time, care, and dedication. And if this was your first time with us, we invite you to explore more of our stories. Each one is chosen and shared with the hope that it finds someone who needs it. Thank you for spending this moment with us. It truly means a lot. We hope to see you again in the next story.